We all saw Max Verstappen run wide at turn 1 of this weekend's French Grand Prix. But how can such a highly skilled driver make what seems like quite a simple mistake? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain exactly what's going on from a driver's perspective heading into turn 1. So I think the first point to make is that there is a lot going on when you're driving a race car, especially at the start of a race. Normally when you're heading into a turn, you'll have some kind of a reference of a braking point where you brake and then you slow the car down and head into that corner at the right speed. And yes, these braking points might change during a race as the fuel weight comes out of the car or as the tyres start to degrade. So as the tyres go off, your braking point will obviously become a little bit earlier up the track. However, at the start of a race, it is quite a different story. You're arriving at the turn 1 in this case, at a completely different speed than you would do otherwise. One of the main things when you're going into turn 1 is just this sense of unknown. There's so many variables happening which we're going to cover in this video. And one of the main ones is the tyre temperature and the balance in those tyres. We all see the drivers weaving around on the green flag lap before they get onto the grid. And this is to try and get the tyres up to the right temperature and, more importantly, between the front and the rear axles. Of course, if your front tyres are warm but your rear tyres are not, the car won't have the right balance. And this is really important, and it's really important to be confident about this as you're heading into turn 1. It's also important to note that the car will be behaving completely differently than it has done for most of the weekend before the race. The cars are full of fuel at this point, 110 kilograms of fuel. And while that may not sound like a massive difference, it makes a huge difference in a Formula 1 car to how quickly the car slows down on the brakes, how quickly it turns through the corner, and then how quickly it accelerates out of that turn. And that's why we see a massive difference in lap times from qualifying through to the first stint of the race. The one thing that I think was probably the biggest attribute to why Max ran wide in turn 1 of the French Grand Prix was probably the tailwind. Paul Ricard is known for having a strong wind that runs down the back straight. However, when you're going into turn 1, that means that you have the wind coming in behind you. You have a tailwind, and this effectively lowers the amount of downforce that the car has because it's essentially moving through the air at a slower speed. I've been lucky enough to drive a number of Formula 1 cars around the Paul Ricard circuit, and you can certainly feel the strength of this wind going down the back straight and into scene versus coming into turn 1, and also in some of the other corners where you cross over the wind, and this makes a big difference as you're turning through a corner. So we've got the imbalance in the tyres, we've got the extra fuel weight, we've got the tailwind, but the other thing to note is that Verstappen also had Hamilton right there. He seemed to get a slightly better start, and so Verstappen was positioned in the middle of the track. That essentially makes turn 1 a bit tighter than it would be if you were on the outside of the circuit, and hence you're going to have to slow the car down a little bit more. But balancing that with staying in front of Hamilton here, because if Verstappen had got on the brakes just a few meters too early, Hamilton would have been able to go around the outside of turn 1 and then been up the inside for turn 2. And obviously he didn't want to make that mistake. Unfortunately for Verstappen in this instance, he braked a little bit too late, tried to carry a little bit too much speed into turn 1, and that was why he went wide. But the thing that stopped him getting into there was the rear of the car. The car had oversteer. He turned the car in and the rear simply didn't have enough grip. And again, this was probably a combination of a couple of things. The rear tyre temperature not being quite right, the extra weight in the car, that tighter line going in, and of course the tailwind not giving the rear wing as much downforce as it might otherwise have done. Be sure to check out these other videos that I think you'll love, and if you're not already subscribed to Driver 61, please consider subscribing. Cheers, and I'll see you next time.